Remember those Wild West lunches no one makes anymore? Hearty, simple meals cooked over open fires or in cast iron pots, meant to fuel a long day on the trail. These 30 forgotten lunches fed cowboys, pioneers, and ranch hands. And it's time we brought them back to the table. Son of a gun stew. In the rough and tumble world of the Wild West, meals were often made from whatever was on hand, and son of a gun stew was a prime example of that frontier ingenuity. This hearty, rustic stew was made from organ meats like beef heart or liver, paired with potatoes, onions, and sometimes a few wild herbs or spices gathered along the trail. The tough cuts of meat would be slow cooked in a cast iron pot over an open fire, turning tender and rich with flavor. The potatoes would soak up the savory broth, making the stew both filling and satisfying. Though the ingredients might seem unappealing today, son of a gun stew was a meal that cowboys and pioneers could rely on for both nutrition and energy. The rich organ meats provided essential protein, while the potatoes offered the sustenance needed for a long day of hard work. It wasn't about fancy flavors, it was about survival. This stew represents the resourcefulness and grit of the Wild West, where nothing went to waste and every meal counted. Fried salt pork with molasses beans. If there's one dish that captures the essence of frontier practicality and comfort, it's fried salt pork with molasses beans. This was the kind of meal that kept a cowboy's stomach full and his morale high during the long hours on the trail or the rough days in a dusty town. Salt pork, with its rich, fatty flavor, was the backbone of many Wild West meals. It was cheap, long-lasting, and packed enough salt to preserve it through harsh conditions. Paired with molasses beans, which balanced the saltiness with a deep sweetness, it was a meal that had both sustenance and soul. Picture a small campfire crackling under a wide, open sky. The salt pork would be frying up in a pan, its fat sizzling as it browned to perfection. Nearby, a pot of beans, likely pinto or navy, would simmer slowly, infused with the dark, comforting sweetness of molasses. The beans would soak up that sweetness while the salt pork crisps up in the heat, turning golden brown and fragrant. The combination of the rich pork and the smoky sweet beans made for a lunch that didn't just fill the belly, but gave you a deep, satisfying warmth. The beauty of this dish was its simplicity. You didn't need much to make it, and yet it tasted like you'd put in hours of effort. The salt pork, often the most affordable meat on the frontier, was salted to preserve it for long journeys, making it a staple in every cowboy's diet. When paired with beans, a hearty, nutritious food that could be carried for miles without spoiling, it became the perfect lunch for a hungry rider or a hardworking ranch hand. Though it may not be the most glamorous of meals, fried salt pork with molasses beans is an authentic taste of the Wild West, reminding us that sometimes the simplest, most humble dishes are the ones that stick with us the longest. Corn Dodger sandwiches. Corn Dodgers were the tough, gritty bread of the frontier. Dense, cornbread-style pucks that were baked or fried over an open flame. They were the kind of thing you could make ahead, pack in a saddlebag, and take with you on a long day's ride. In the Wild West, nothing went to waste, and a corn dodger was a simple yet durable way to stretch a meal. When paired with hearty smoked meats or a dollop of onion jam, corn dodger sandwiches became a portable, filling lunch for a cowboy, a settler, or anyone out in the wide open. Imagine a dusty midday break on the trail, the sun high overhead. The campfire smoke still lingers in the air, and a cowboy reaches into his bag for a couple of cornbread dodgers. They're dense, with a slight crispness to the outside, their insides soft and corny. He splits them open and piles them with leftover roast beef or maybe a few slices of cured ham, making a makeshift sandwich that's more about practicality than finesse, but oh, it's just what he needs to keep going. Maybe he spreads a little onion jam on the inside, something sweet to balance the saltiness of the meat, and takes a bite, feeling the chewy cornbread stick to his teeth as the flavors meld together. Corn Dodgers were about survival, plain and simple. With just cornmeal, water, salt, and maybe a bit of lard, you could make a batch that would last for days, even on a long cattle drive. They weren't the lightest bread in the world, but they were filling. And once you paired them with whatever meat or preserves you had on hand, they were a meal in themselves. Today, we may think of sandwiches as a quick lunch or a deli special, but in the Wild West, corn dodger sandwiches were a testament to the resourcefulness of frontier cooks. They didn't have the luxury of a bakery on every corner, but they sure knew how to make a sandwich that could go the distance. Slapjack and bacon stack. In the Wild West, breakfast was often eaten at high noon, and the slapjack, a thick, lumpy pancake, was the perfect fuel for a hard day's work. It wasn't the delicate, fluffy flapjack we might think of today, but a hearty, dense griddle cake made with a little more grit and a lot more substance. Cowboys, ranchers, and settlers alike would cook these slapjacks in the early morning or at midday when they had a break from their labor. They were fried in sizzling bacon fat and stacked high with crispy bacon between each layer, making a meal that stuck to the ribs and gave enough energy to keep a man going, no matter how long his day was. The process of making slapjacks was simple: cornmeal, flour, eggs, milk, and a touch of salt. There wasn't much in the way of sugar, and it was less about making something light and fluffy and more about creating something sturdy, something that could survive a long day and stay with you. The batter would be ladled onto a well-seasoned griddle or cast iron skillet, cooked until golden brown, then topped with bacon. Another Wild West staple, prized for its ability to last and provide hearty protein when fresh meat was scarce. Now, imagine a dusty trail camp with a crackling fire and the smell of sizzling bacon filling the air. As the slapjacks cook, they soak up that bacon grease, adding layers of flavor. Once they're golden and firm, the slapjack stack is built. Slapjack, bacon, until you've got a tower of hearty, greasy goodness. The bacon, crisped just right, peeks through the layers, adding a smoky crunch to each bite. For the cowboys who needed a midday meal on the trail, this was a simple but filling dish. It wasn't about elegance, but practicality. Slapjack and bacon stacked together offered calories, energy, and a touch of comfort after a long ride. It was the kind of meal that made you feel grounded on the dusty plains, earthy, satisfying, and ready to take on whatever came next. Liver and onion skillet hash. When it came to cooking on the frontier, nothing was wasted, especially not the offcuts of meat. Liver, often overlooked today, was a prized source of nutrition in the Wild West. It was hearty, rich in iron, and could be cooked in countless ways. One of the most common and beloved preparations was liver and onion skillet hash. It was the kind of dish you'd make when you had a day's worth of energy to burn and a need to fill up quickly. The aroma of sizzling onions and liver over an open flame would drift across a dusty camp, calling workers to the table. Onions, sliced thick, would be caramelized in the cast iron skillet, their sweetness mellowing as they browned in the pork or beef fat left over from breakfast. Meanwhile, chunks of liver, tenderized and seasoned, would be added, searing quickly in the hot pan. The result was a comforting rustic meal that combined the earthy richness of the liver with the sweet bite of onions, a dish that stuck to your ribs and gave you the energy to keep working. The beauty of liver and onion hash was in its simplicity. The liver, often cooked until just browned on the outside and slightly pink inside, retained its bold, gamey flavor, while the onions added a bit of sweetness and balance. Sometimes potatoes, either fresh or leftover from the night before, would be chopped and thrown in, adding texture and substance to the dish. A sprinkle of salt and pepper finished it off, but the real secret was in the way it was cooked slowly over the fire, coaxing all the flavors out until they melded together in the skillet. For the ranch hands or pioneers working long hours, this dish was an essential source of protein and energy. Liver was cheap, and onions were easily grown, so together they made a perfect frontier meal. Though it might not win any modern-day food awards, liver and onion skillet hash is a dish that perfectly captures the utilitarian and resourceful spirit of the Wild West, where every ingredient had a purpose and every meal was a testament to survival. Pioneer egg bread. Pioneer egg bread was the kind of dish you'd cook when you had a little bit of time and a handful of basic ingredients that could be turned into something hearty and satisfying. This cross between cornbread and French toast was a frontier classic, often prepared over a campfire or in a wood stove on a quiet morning. Rich with eggs and milk, it was dense, filling, and surprisingly versatile. Perfect for feeding a group of tired cowhands or a bustling family on the frontier. The beauty of this dish was its simplicity. Made from flour, cornmeal, eggs, and milk, with a splash of molasses or honey if you were lucky, it was essentially a sweet, eggy bread. But it wasn't quite as fluffy as modern cakes or bread. Instead, it had a thick, substantial texture that could hold up to whatever was thrown on top or slathered on the side. Once baked in a cast iron skillet, it formed a golden crust with a soft, slightly sweet center that was perfect for pairing with anything from jam to savory sausage. On the frontier, eggs were a luxury that had to be used wisely. So when they were available, they often found their way into dishes like Pioneer egg bread, which could be eaten as a breakfast or a quick lunch. For a cowhand, it was a great way to fuel up for the day ahead. For a Pioneer family, it was the kind of meal that could stretch and feed several hungry mouths, especially when served with butter, syrup, or the occasional piece of salted pork or ham. The dish had a humble, unpretentious quality to it, just the sort of comfort food you needed after a long, exhausting morning of chores or travel. But despite its simplicity, Pioneer egg bread had the kind of heartiness that could settle the stomach and steady the nerves. There was something about the combination of eggs, milk, and cornmeal baked until golden brown that felt like home no matter where you were on the open frontier. Chili with pinto and jackrabbit. In the Wild West, a hearty bowl of chili was more than just a meal. It was a source of warmth and comfort after a long day of hard work or travel. This particular version, made with pinto beans and jackrabbit, was a perfect reflection of frontier ingenuity. With limited resources, cowboys and settlers learned to make the most of what they had, and that often meant relying on the local wildlife, like jackrabbit, which was plentiful and made for a flavorful, gamey protein. The jackrabbit would be cleaned and its meat slow cooked until tender, then chopped or shredded into bite-sized pieces. Pinto beans, hearty and filling, would be simmered alongside the rabbit, absorbing all the deep flavors from the meat and the spices. The chili would be cooked low and slow over a fire or a stove, its rich scent curling into the air, coaxing tired cowhands or miners to gather round the pot. In a world where meals were often made from whatever was available, this chili provided sustenance, warmth, and the occasional bite of adventure. The seasoning for this dish was simple but effective: salt, pepper, and a bit of dried chili powder. Some versions of the chili would also include wild onions or a dash of vinegar to give it that perfect balance of earthy richness and a little tang. Of course, in the harsh conditions of the frontier, ingredients like tomatoes or peppers might have been scarce, so it was the simple, hearty combination of beans and meat that stood at the center of the meal. Chili with pinto and jackrabbit wasn't just a meal. It was an embodiment of the Wild West spirit. Resourceful, rustic, and undeniably satisfying. Whether served in a tin plate on a campfire or dished out in a cozy homestead kitchen, it was a dish that could bring people together and keep them going through even the toughest days. Train Depot Sandwich Loaf. The Train Depot Sandwich Loaf was the kind of lunch that made traveling across the vast, dusty landscape just a bit easier. With the expansion of the railroads, long journeys became more common, and so did the need for a sturdy, transportable lunch. This dish, often made for railroad workers or travelers hopping from town to town, was an inventive way to turn leftovers into something practical for the road. Think of it as an early version of the pack sandwich, but with a little more substance and a lot of frontier flavor. The sandwich loaf was made by layering slices of meatloaf, often a mixture of ground beef, salt pork, and breadcrumbs, between thick slices of bread. This hearty loaf could be prepared the night before, cooled, and then sliced into thick, manageable pieces that would hold up for hours without falling apart. The meatloaf itself, would be seasoned with a simple combination of onions, salt, pepper, and perhaps a touch of mustard, creating a savory filling that would make even the longest train ride a bit more bearable. Once assembled, the loaf could be wrapped up and carried in a sack, ready for when hunger struck. Whether eaten on the train, on the move, or during a midday break in a bustling depot, this sandwich loaf was the epitome of convenience and sustenance. And while it wasn't fancy by today's standards, it was the kind of meal that worked perfectly for the time. There was no need for delicate bread or fancy condiments, just thick, sturdy bread and a meatloaf filling that would provide all the energy needed to keep going. Train Depot sandwich loaf wasn't just practical, it was a nostalgic reminder of a time when food needed to be reliable, filling, and easy to carry. It was a meal that could withstand the bumps and jolts of a train ride, and its simplicity was part of its charm, perfectly embodying the resourceful spirit of the Wild West. Cactus fry bread wraps. In the Wild West, there were few meals more resourceful or symbolic of the land than cactus fry bread wraps. Inspired by the Native American traditions of cooking with ingredients found in the desert, this dish combined the chewy, savory goodness of fry bread with the unique flavors of locally foraged foods like prickly pear cactus. It's a meal that captured the ingenuity of frontier cooks who had to rely on what the land provided and make the most of it. Cactus, particularly the prickly pear, was a versatile ingredient on the frontier. The pads, or nopales, could be peeled, sliced, and cooked into a tangy, earthy filling for fry bread. The combination of the slightly sweet, acidic cactus and the hearty fry bread created a perfect balance of flavors. Fry bread itself, golden and crisp on the outside, soft on the inside, was made from simple pantry staples like flour, baking powder, water, and salt, then fried in hot lard or oil to create a satisfying texture. To make cactus fry bread wraps, the fry bread would be fried to perfection and then wrapped around a filling of sautéed nopal cactus, sometimes accompanied by smoked meat like venison or beef, and occasionally seasoned with chili, onions, and garlic. The result was a meal that could be eaten with one hand, perfect for cowboys, settlers, or anyone needing a quick, filling lunch while out on the move. Though it may not have been a fancy meal, cactus fry bread wraps were a beautiful example of frontier resourcefulness. It took advantage of what nature had to offer, whether the local cactus or game meat, and combined it with ingredients that could be easily carried or traded for. This dish wasn't just about sustenance, it was about the ability to adapt, to use what was available, and to find nourishment in the most unlikely places. Whether served in a simple camp, around a chuck wagon, or in a quiet home on the prairie, cactus fry bread wraps were a Wild West lunch that connected people to the land and to each other. Squirrel pie with mustard gravy. When you think of frontier meals, you might imagine beef, pork, or chicken as the go-to proteins. But out on the Wild West, sometimes survival required a bit more ingenuity. Enter squirrel pie. This rustic, hearty dish was a clever way to make use of readily available game, and it combined the resourcefulness of settlers and pioneers with the flavors of the land they inhabited. While it might seem unusual today, squirrel pie was a delicious and filling option that kept many a cowboy or homesteader well-fed during lean times. Squirrel, often hunted in abundance in the woods, was an easy-to-catch source of meat that could be roasted, stewed, or, if you were feeling particularly inventive, baked into a savory pie. The process was simple. The squirrel would be cleaned, cooked down into tender chunks of meat, and mixed with onions, garlic, carrots, and a few herbs to form a rich filling. To make it truly comforting, it was encased in a buttery, flaky pie crust, then baked until golden and crisp. What really set this dish apart, though, was the mustard gravy. The gravy, made from a rich stock, a splash of mustard, and a bit of flour to thicken it up, brought a tangy, bold kick to the pie. The mustard's sharpness cut through the richness of the squirrel and the crust, making each bite a balance of flavors, earthy, savory, and just the right amount of zing. The gravy was poured over the warm pie when served, creating a comforting, satisfying meal that was perfect for a cold evening on the prairie or a long, tiring day in the saddle. Squirrel pie with mustard gravy wasn't just a meal. It was a testament to the resilience of frontier cooks who used every part of the land to their advantage. It may seem unusual to us now, but back then it was a practical, delicious, and resourceful dish that made the best of what the Wild West had to offer. Today it reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected ingredients can come together to create something truly memorable. Pickled pig's feet and dry biscuits. In the days of the Wild West, nothing went to waste, especially not when it came to meat. Pickled pig's feet were a classic example of frontier ingenuity, using every part of the animal and preserving it for long journeys or times of scarcity. These salty, vinegary morsels were not only practical, but also packed with flavor. Paired with dry, sturdy biscuits, another frontier staple, this meal was a true reflection of the resourcefulness that defined the era. The pig's feet would be simmered for hours, tenderized, and then pickled in a brine made from vinegar, water, salt, and spices like garlic, peppercorns, and mustard seeds. The result was a tangy, savory dish that had a bold flavor and a chewy texture. These pickled pig's feet were perfect for preserving over time, allowing cowhands and settlers to carry them during long travels or keep them stocked in their pantries when fresh meat was in short supply. As for the biscuits, they were often made with simple ingredients like flour, baking soda, salt, and lard, which were then mixed into a dense dough and baked to a crispy golden finish. Though they were typically a bit dry, these biscuits were designed to last, making them the ideal accompaniment to the moist, flavorful pickled pig's feet. The two together formed a meal that was equal parts salty, tangy, and filling, a perfect dish for a long day on the trail or for a ranch hand looking to refuel after hours of labor. Pickled pig's feet and dry biscuits weren't exactly a delicacy, but they served their purpose, sustaining the hard-working people of the Wild West. The tangy, briny flavor of the pig's feet combined with the hearty texture of the biscuits made for a meal that was both practical and deeply satisfying. And though it may not be the most glamorous dish, it was a true representation of the resourceful spirit of the time. After all, when you're living on the edge of civilization, you make do with what you have. And sometimes, what you have is pickled pig's feet. Prairie oyster and tomato gravy. In the rugged landscape of the Wild West, nothing was too unconventional when it came to food, and prairie oysters were no exception. This dish, made from the testicles of cattle, became a surprisingly popular meal for cowboys and settlers who had learned not to waste any part of the animals they raised. Also known as Rocky Mountain oysters, these prairie oysters were a source of protein that was both plentiful and resourceful. When prepared and cooked properly, they could be tender and delicious, especially when smothered in a rich, savory tomato gravy. The preparation of prairie oysters began with carefully cleaning the organ meat, removing the tough outer skin, and slicing it into thin pieces. The slices were then dredged in seasoned flour, salt, and pepper, and fried in hot oil until golden and crispy. This method of frying ensured that the organ meat's naturally mild flavor was transformed into something hearty, crispy, and satisfying. What really made this dish stand out, however, was the tomato gravy. The gravy was made from a simple combination of tomatoes, onions, and flour, slowly simmered together to form a rich, thick sauce. A dash of pepper and perhaps a little vinegar or Worcestershire sauce would bring out its tangy, savory character. When the prairie oysters were served, they were topped with this luscious gravy, which added both moisture and depth of flavor to the otherwise crispy fried meat. Prairie oyster and tomato gravy was the perfect dish for the hardworking cowboy or homesteader who was used to making the most out of what the land and livestock provided. It wasn't a meal for the faint-hearted, but for those who embraced the resourcefulness of frontier living, it was a savory, satisfying dish that connected them to the land. The dish became a social event as well, often served to large groups around the campfire with stories and laughter flowing as freely as the gravy. It was a taste of the Wild West that pushed the boundaries of what was considered a normal, but made for a meal that was unforgettable. Slung iron beans with wild onions. In the Wild West, nothing brought people together quite like a pot of beans. They were cheap, filling, and easy to cook, making them a staple for cowboys, settlers, and anyone traveling the rugged terrain. Slung iron beans with wild onions is the kind of dish that captures the spirit of frontier life, resourceful, hearty, and made from what you could forage, trade, or hunt. The slung iron part refers to the cast iron pot or Dutch oven used to cook these beans over an open fire, creating a meal that was as rustic as it was satisfying. The beans, usually pinto or navy, would be soaked overnight to soften them, then slowly simmered for hours over the fire in a cast iron pot. Wild onions, a common forage on the frontier, were gathered from nearby fields or prairies and added to the pot to impart a rich, earthy flavor. The onions would infuse the beans with a natural sweetness and depth, making the dish more flavorful without the need for fancy seasonings. A pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, and maybe some dried herbs were often all that was needed to make the dish come to life. What made this dish truly unique was the wild onions, which were a reminder of how frontier cooks had to rely on local plants for flavor. These onions could be found in abundance in the wild, and they added an unmistakable taste of the land itself, sharp, pungent, and perfect for cutting through the earthiness of the beans. The slow cooking process in the slung iron pot allowed the flavors to meld together, creating a thick, hearty stew that would sustain a cowboy for hours. Slung iron beans with wild onions wasn't just a meal, it was a connection to the land and to the tradition of frontier cooking. It was a dish made with what was available, cooked with care, and eaten with a sense of pride. Whether shared around a campfire or in a homestead kitchen, this humble meal represented the Wild West's unrelenting spirit of survival and community. Buffalo tallow biscuits and gravy. In the heart of the Wild West, buffalo was not just a symbol of the open plains, it was a source of sustenance for the people who lived there. Every part of the buffalo was put to good use. Its meat fed the settlers and cowboys, its hide was turned into clothing, and even its fat or tallow was used in cooking. Buffalo tallow biscuits and gravy was a rustic, hearty dish that made use of what was available, turning the rich, gamey tallow into something both practical and satisfying. It was the kind of meal that would fuel a cowboy or settler for a long day of work under the blazing sun or through the freezing winds of winter. To make the biscuits, buffalo tallow would replace the more common lard or butter, creating a biscuit that was dense, rich, and full of flavor. The tallow, rendered from the fat of a buffalo, gave the biscuits a golden color and a slightly gamey taste that set them apart from regular biscuits. When baked, they developed a crispy outer layer with a soft, crumbly interior, perfect for sopping up gravy. The gravy was the perfect complement to the biscuits, thick and creamy with a savory richness that came from the drippings of roasted meat or, in some cases, from more buffalo fat. To make the gravy, you'd melt the tallow in a skillet, then whisk in a little flour to make a roux, before slowly adding milk or stock to create a smooth, velvety sauce. A pinch of salt and pepper was all that was needed to season it. There were no fancy ingredients, but the flavor was undeniably satisfying. Together, the buffalo tallow biscuits and gravy created a meal that was filling, comforting, and grounded in the reality of frontier life. It wasn't about delicacy or sophistication. It was about survival, community, and making the most of the land and its resources. For settlers, cowhands, and travelers, this dish was a reminder of the Wild West's rugged spirit, where every meal, no matter how simple, was a celebration of the tough, resourceful lifestyle that defined the era. Potash and vinegar slaw sandwiches. When you think of a frontier meal, a slaw sandwich might not be the first thing that comes to mind. But on the Wild West frontier, practicality often triumphed over gourmet ideas. And this dish was a true testament to that. Potash and vinegar slaw sandwiches were the kind of meal that settlers and cowhands would put together when they had limited ingredients and needed something that could last through long days of hard work or travel. The key to the sandwich was potash, an early leavening agent made from wood ashes, and vinegar, which added a tart bite to the otherwise simple cabbage slaw. The slaw itself was made by finely shredding cabbage, a crop that was easy to grow and could survive the unpredictable conditions of the frontier. The cabbage was mixed with a simple dressing made from vinegar, salt, and sugar. Some versions of the slaw also included a touch of mustard or a splash of milk, but the classic version was more about the sharp tang from the vinegar and the crunch of the cabbage. Potash, which was often gathered from the ashes of the fire, was used to help soften the cabbage and give the slaw a slight lift. It was a frugal, clever way of using what you had on hand. To turn the slaw into a meal, it was heaped between slices of thick, sturdy bread. The bread, whether homemade or hardtack, was dense and durable, able to hold up to the weight of the slaw without falling apart. The sandwich wasn't particularly fancy, but it was refreshing and hearty enough to provide energy during a long day on the trail or working the land. For those who didn't have the luxury of refrigeration, the vinegar helped preserve the slaw, making it a meal that could last for a while without spoiling. Potash and vinegar slaw sandwiches were humble, but they were a reflection of the frontier spirit. Make do with what you've got and don't waste a thing. This simple dish, made with basic ingredients, could turn a few heads of cabbage and some stale bread into a satisfying and filling lunch. It wasn't gourmet, but it sure was practical. And sometimes that's all you needed on the harsh, dusty plains. Choke cherry chutney cold cuts. In the Wild West, food was often about survival and making the most of what was available in the environment. Choke cherry chutney cold cuts are a perfect example of frontier ingenuity, turning humble ingredients into something surprisingly delightful. Choke cherries, native to North America, were abundant in many areas, and settlers learned to make use of their tart, berry-like flavor in a variety of ways. When combined with smoked or cured meats, the result was a tangy, sweet, and savory dish that could be served at a midday meal or packed for the trail. The chutney itself was made by cooking down choke cherries with sugar, vinegar, and a variety of spices like cinnamon, cloves, and sometimes even a little mustard seed. The mixture would be simmered until it thickened into a jam-like consistency, with a balance of sweet and sour that paired perfectly with the rich, salty flavors of smoked meats like ham, beef, or even wild game. The chutney could be jarred and preserved, making it an ideal condiment for long journeys or times when fresh ingredients were hard to come by. To make the cold cuts, slices of cured or smoked meat would be stacked between slices of sturdy bread, and a generous spread of choke cherry chutney would be smeared on top. The sweetness of the chutney provided a sharp contrast to the savory meat, creating a delightful balance of flavors. Though it might seem like an odd combination today, the dish was an efficient way to enjoy the best of the Wild West's preserved meats and foraged fruits all in one bite. Choke cherry chutney cold cuts were a meal born from the necessity of the time. They were easy to make, full of flavor, and could be packed and stored for future use. The tangy sweetness of the chutney complemented the richness of the meat, turning what could have been a plain, ordinary sandwich into something memorable and special. It was a reminder that in the Wild West, you used what the land gave you, and sometimes what it gave you made all the difference in the world. Mesquite smoked trout cakes. When settlers and cowhands of the Wild West found themselves near rivers or streams, they didn't just fish for leisure, they fished for survival. Mesquite smoked trout cakes are a perfect example of how frontier cooks transformed a simple catch into a delicious, hearty meal that could feed a group after a long day of work or travel. Trout, abundant in many western rivers, was a prized catch, and its delicate, flaky flesh could be preserved through smoking, turning it into a flavorful, long-lasting ingredient. When combined with the woodsy, slightly sweet flavor of mesquite smoke, trout became a unique, savory base for these fried fish cakes. To make mesquite smoked trout cakes, the fish would first be cleaned and smoked over a mesquite fire, which imparted a deep, aromatic flavor. The trout's delicate flesh would then be flaked and mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, and perhaps a little mustard or hot sauce for extra kick. A dash of salt and pepper would round out the seasoning, and the mixture would be formed into patties before being fried in hot oil or lard. The result was a crispy, golden exterior with a tender, flavorful interior that brought together the smoky essence of the trout and the richness of the fried crust. These trout cakes were incredibly versatile. They could be served as part of a larger meal with potatoes or beans, or packed and eaten on the go as a trail lunch. For settlers who were living off the land, being able to catch and preserve fish meant they had a steady source of protein, and making trout cakes allowed them to stretch that protein further, creating a dish that could feed more people. The mesquite smoke not only preserved the fish, but also infused it with a distinctive flavor that was emblematic of the Wild West's unique culinary heritage. Mesquite smoked trout cakes are more than just a meal. They're a celebration of resourcefulness, a dish born from the need to make the most of the land. They reflect the spirit of the Wild West, where a hearty, flavorful meal was never far away when you knew how to work with nature. Pickled egg and mustard seed flatbread. In the Wild West, food often had to be simple, durable, and portable. Qualities that made pickled egg and mustard seed flatbread a perfect meal for cowboys and settlers who spent long days on the move. Eggs, a relatively affordable source of protein, were a precious commodity, and when pickled, they could be stored for long periods, making them an ideal snack or lunch during extended travel. Paired with mustard seed flatbread, this dish was not only filling but had a satisfying tang and depth of flavor that made it more than just sustenance. It was a true frontier comfort food. The pickled eggs, typically hard-boiled, were steeped in a brine made from vinegar, water, salt, and spices like mustard seeds, garlic, and perhaps a touch of sugar or chili flakes. The brining process allowed the eggs to take on a sharp, tangy flavor that complemented the richness of the egg yolk. Pickled eggs were easy to prepare in bulk, and their vinegar base made them incredibly long-lasting. So they were a perfect option for those who needed to stockpile food for a journey or store it for the winter. The flatbread, meanwhile, was made from simple ingredients: flour, water, salt, and sometimes a little fat, and cooked quickly over an open flame. The bread itself was sturdy and somewhat chewy, making it an excellent vehicle for the pickled eggs. Mustard seeds would be sprinkled into the dough, giving the bread a subtle, warm spice that paired beautifully with the sharpness of the eggs. Once cooked, the flatbread would be soft yet slightly crisp around the edges, offering a perfect contrast to the richness of the pickled egg. To eat, the flatbread would be torn into pieces, topped with a pickled egg, and maybe even a little more mustard or pepper if desired. It was a meal that could be eaten quickly in the field, whether as a midday break on the trail or a simple dinner around the campfire. It may not have been fancy, but pickled egg and mustard seed flatbread was nourishing and easy to prepare, embodying the spirit of the Wild West, practical, flavorful, and made to last. Mormon funeral potatoes with hardtack crumble. Mormon funeral potatoes, a dish with roots deep in frontier cooking, was the perfect comfort food for a community that often had to make do with limited ingredients. Despite the somewhat somber name, this dish was a celebration of resourcefulness and practicality. Often prepared for large gatherings like church events, or, as the name suggests, funerals, it was made in large, hearty quantities, ensuring that everyone in attendance would be well fed. The dish is a casserole of potatoes, cream, cheese, and sometimes ham, topped with a crunchy layer of hardtack crumble for texture. The base of the dish was made with cubed potatoes, usually left over from another meal or stored in root cellars for the long winter. These potatoes would be combined with a creamy sauce made from milk or cream, cheese, often cheddar, and a bit of flour to thicken it. If meat was available, bits of ham or bacon might be stirred in for flavor and protein. The mixture was then placed in a baking dish and topped with crushed hardtack, a staple of frontier cooking, providing a crunchy topping that added both flavor and texture. Hardtack, the dense, dry cracker, had a long shelf life and was perfect for crumbling over dishes like this to create a satisfying crunch. Baked until golden and bubbly, Mormon funeral potatoes with hardtack crumble had a creamy, rich filling with a crispy golden top. The potatoes softened into a velvety texture as they absorbed the creamy sauce, while the hardtack crumble gave each bite a hearty crunch that contrasted wonderfully with the softness of the potatoes. It was a dish designed to feed many and provide sustenance for long stretches of hard work. This dish was simple but incredibly comforting. It reflected the pragmatic, survivalist nature of frontier cooking, where ingredients had to go a long way and meals needed to be filling. Mormon funeral potatoes with hardtack crumble was a reminder of how the early settlers made the most of what they had, turning basic, shelf-stable ingredients into a meal that could bring warmth and satisfaction to any table. Sheepherders coffee stew. On the open range, where fresh vegetables or gourmet ingredients were a rare luxury, sheepherders coffee stew was a dish born out of necessity and a bit of ingenuity. A true cowboy's meal, this stew made use of whatever ingredients were available, but its secret ingredient was the unexpected addition of strong coffee. Coffee, a staple drink for any cowboy, was often brewed in large quantities to keep the men alert and ready for the next stretch of work. But it didn't stop there. In the hands of a seasoned cook, coffee became the backbone of a hearty stew, adding a deep, rich flavor that set it apart from your average pot of beans or beef stew. The base of the stew was simple: tough cuts of meat, usually lamb or beef, often the less tender parts of the animal that required slow cooking, together with beans and potatoes. The coffee, bold and black, would be added to the stew while it simmered over the fire. As the stew cooked, the coffee would slowly infuse the broth, imparting a robust, earthy undertone to the dish. The result was a stew that was rich and comforting, its dark, savory broth unlike any typical stew or soup. Along with the coffee, onions, garlic, and whatever herbs or dried spices were available would add flavor, though the dish remained simple and practical, perfect for a long day on the trail. This hearty meal could be made in one pot, making it easy for cowboys and sheepherders to prepare on the move, and its filling nature helped keep the men energized and full. The combination of meat, beans, and potatoes provided the necessary sustenance, while the coffee transformed the dish into something uniquely satisfying. Sheepherders coffee stew wasn't about being fancy or refined. It was about survival, comfort, and making do with what was at hand. It embodied the spirit of frontier cooking, where meals had to be nourishing, practical, and able to feed a group of hardworking folks. This stew, with its unexpected twist, served as a reminder that in the Wild West, cooking was about resourcefulness and a bit of adventurous spirit. Sometimes, a strong cup of coffee was just what you needed to make a meal extraordinary. Biscuits and cold sawmill gravy. Biscuits and gravy might be a comfort food staple today, but in the Wild West, it was a hearty, no-frills meal designed to fuel a day of hard work on the range or in the fields. Biscuits, made from basic pantry staples like flour, baking soda, salt, and lard, were a simple yet vital part of the cowboy or settler's diet. But what really made this dish stand out was the cold sawmill gravy that accompanied it. This wasn't a silky, creamy sauce. It was a thick, hearty gravy that had been made the night before, often from the remnants of bacon grease or pan drippings, and served the next day for a fulfilling, satisfying meal. The cold sawmill gravy, left to cool and thicken overnight, was the epitome of frontier practicality. It started with a base of rendered bacon or sausage fat, where bits of leftover meat and drippings would be browned to give the gravy a deep, savory flavor. Flour would then be added to make a roux, and once the mixture had thickened, water or milk would be poured in, creating a rich, dense sauce that could be served over the biscuits. Seasoned with salt and pepper, the gravy was a no-nonsense addition to the dish. No fuss, just a thick, salty bite that paired perfectly with the slightly crumbly, warm biscuits. When it came time to eat, a biscuit would be torn apart, slathered in the cold, thick gravy, and eaten with a side of bacon, sausage, or sometimes eggs, depending on what was available. The combination of the fluffy, slightly crumbly biscuit and the thick, savory gravy was filling, comforting, and gave the ranch hands or travelers the energy they needed to tackle the day ahead. Though this meal wasn't fancy, it was incredibly satisfying, offering warmth and sustenance when it was needed most. Biscuits and cold sawmill gravy were a symbol of the Wild West's resourcefulness and hardworking spirit. There was no time for fussy recipes or delicate dishes. Food had to be practical, filling, and able to stretch to feed large groups. This dish, though simple, perfectly embodied the no-nonsense approach to cooking in the West. Make the most of what you have and make it last. And when the day was long, the work hard, and the weather harsh, nothing was more satisfying than a plate of biscuits smothered in cold sawmill gravy, prairie pie, mock apple. When settlers and cowboys were out on the trail or living on the frontier, they had to be creative with what they could get from the land. Fresh fruit was a rare treat, especially in the harsh conditions of the Wild West, but prairie pie or mock apple pie was a clever way to satisfy a craving for a sweet, comforting dessert without relying on fresh apples. Instead, this pie used soda crackers to mimic the texture of apples, transforming a simple pantry staple into a surprisingly delightful treat. The dish was born out of necessity, as apples were often hard to come by on the frontier, and other fruits, like berries or wild plums, were seasonal at best. So, prairie pie made use of the ubiquitous soda cracker, which was available in most frontier kitchens, and used it to create a filling that resembled the taste and texture of apple pie. The crackers would be soaked in water, sugar, and spices, like cinnamon and nutmeg, then baked in a pie crust to create the illusion of apples inside. The pie was sweetened with sugar, and sometimes a bit of lemon juice or cream would be added to give it the tartness and richness that apple pie would typically have. Once the pie was baked, the crackers would absorb the liquid and soften into a texture that closely resembled stewed apples, giving the dish a pleasantly chewy filling. The sweet spices, along with the hint of lemon, gave the pie a flavor similar to traditional apple pie, though it had its own unique charm. To top it off, the crust would be golden and flaky, adding that perfect touch of buttery richness. Prairie pie, or mock apple pie, was more than just a clever use of available ingredients. It was a symbol of the frontier spirit. It reflected the ingenuity and resourcefulness that settlers relied on to create comfort in difficult times. This pie wasn't just about satisfying a sweet tooth. It was about making the best out of what was available, turning a handful of crackers into something that tasted like home. Though it might not have had the luxury of fresh apples, prairie pie was a reminder that, on the frontier, even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something surprisingly satisfying. Pepper jelly and salt cracker stack. In the Wild West, when fresh food was scarce or when you needed a quick, filling snack during a long day of work, meals had to be simple yet satisfying. Pepper jelly and salt cracker stacks were the perfect example of frontier ingenuity. With just a few basic ingredients, saltine crackers, pepper jelly, and sometimes a dollop of cheese or cured meat, you could create a tasty, energizing snack or even a light lunch. This dish was a reminder of the West's resourceful spirit, turning pantry staples into a flavorful bite that could be eaten on the go or shared with friends around the campfire. Pepper jelly, often homemade and made from a variety of peppers, including sweet and hot varieties, was a popular preserve in frontier kitchens. It was sweet, spicy, and tangy, with a kick of heat balanced by the sweetness of sugar and fruit, often with the addition of vinegar to balance it all. The jelly was typically spread over a simple saltine cracker, which acted as a sturdy base. The saltiness of the cracker was the perfect counterpoint to the sweet and spicy jelly, creating a delightful contrast of flavors in every bite. While the basic version of the pepper jelly stack was just jelly and crackers, more elaborate variations were common. Some cooks might add a slice of cheese, sharp cheddar was a favorite, or a sliver of cured ham or sausage to add extra richness. The combination of the crisp, salty cracker, the spicy sweet jelly, and the creamy cheese or smoky meat created a bite-sized snack that packed a lot of flavor and energy, perfect for fueling a hard-working cowboy or settler. Pepper jelly and salt cracker stacks were a quintessential Wild West snack, quick and simple, but with a satisfying combination of flavors. They were the kind of dish you could make with a handful of basic ingredients you likely already had in your pantry, yet they managed to be flavorful and exciting. Whether enjoyed in the middle of a busy day or as a light, easy appetizer for a frontier gathering, this dish was a testament to the creativity and practicality that defined the frontier way of life. Leftover brisket with cornmeal mush. In the Wild West, food was often about making the most of leftovers, and leftover brisket with cornmeal mush is a perfect example of how pioneers and cowhands could turn yesterday's meal into something delicious and hearty for today. Brisket, a tough cut of meat, was slow cooked to tenderness, often over an open fire or in a cast iron pot, and served as the centerpiece of a meal. But in a land where resources were scarce, nothing went to waste. Leftover brisket, once cooled and sliced, could be repurposed into a simple, filling dish when paired with cornmeal mush, a classic frontier staple. Cornmeal mush was made from cornmeal, water, or milk, and a pinch of salt, then boiled until it thickened into a smooth, creamy consistency. While it might seem humble, it was the perfect base for any leftover meat. The mush was hearty, comforting, and able to take on the flavors of whatever was added to it. In this case, the brisket, sliced thinly and chopped into small pieces, would be mixed into the mush, allowing the beef's rich, smoky flavor to infuse the soft cornmeal. The meat would warm through, adding a savory bite to the otherwise simple dish. A dash of salt and pepper would round out the seasoning, and if available, a sprinkle of cheese could be added for extra richness. What made this dish so satisfying was the combination of textures and flavors. The cornmeal mush was creamy and smooth, the brisket tender and flavorful from the slow cooking, and the seasoning simple but delicious. Whether served for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, it was a meal that made the most of what was available, turning scraps into something that could nourish you for hours. Leftover brisket with cornmeal mush might not have been the most glamorous meal, but it was exactly the kind of resourceful cooking that defined life in the Wild West. It was a dish that could be made quickly, with ingredients on hand, and it offered the sustenance needed to keep working, riding, or traveling. In the harsh realities of frontier life, nothing was wasted, and every meal was an opportunity to make the best out of what you had: fried gizzards and road apples. In the Wild West, resourcefulness was key, and nothing went to waste, especially when it came to the meat from the animals that settlers and cowboys hunted or raised. Fried gizzards and road apples, a term for fried potatoes, not, as the name might suggest, something more unpleasant, is a dish that's as rugged as the men and women who made it. Often prepared over a campfire or in a rough homestead kitchen, this hearty meal made use of every part of the animal, including the gizzards, and paired it with the satisfying crispness of fried potatoes, providing both protein and carbs to keep the cowboy or ranch hand energized through long days of hard work. The gizzards, typically from chickens or turkeys, were cleaned, tenderized, and then seasoned with salt and pepper. They would be coated in a flour mixture, sometimes with a bit of cornmeal for added texture, and fried in a hot pan with lard or bacon grease until they were golden brown and crispy on the outside, while remaining juicy and tender inside. The fried gizzards were chewy, rich in flavor, and full of heart. Exactly what a cowboy or settler needed to power through the day. Alongside the gizzards, road apples, fried potatoes, were prepared. Potatoes, a staple crop for frontier families, were diced or sliced and fried in the same pan, absorbing the flavors of the grease and creating a crispy golden exterior. These potatoes were crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and provided a satisfying contrast to the gizzards. A little salt, maybe some dried herbs, and occasionally a touch of onion or garlic would be thrown in to elevate the flavor. Fried gizzards and road apples weren't just filling, they were a reminder of the toughness and resourcefulness of frontier life. Gizzards, often overlooked today, were an excellent source of protein and were easy to preserve or use when other cuts of meat weren't available. Paired with the versatile potato, it was a meal that could be made quickly with minimal ingredients. Whether eaten in a small cabin, around a chuck wagon, or in a rough and tumble frontier town, This dish was a testament to the pioneering spirit of making something out of nothing. It was simple, hearty, and practical, exactly what you needed in the unforgiving landscape of the Wild West. Sour milk cheese biscuits. In the rugged Wild West, nothing went to waste, and sour milk was no exception. When milk soured, it wasn't discarded. Instead, it became a valuable ingredient in many frontier kitchens. Sour milk cheese biscuits were a perfect example of how resourceful settlers used every available ingredient to make filling, hearty meals. These biscuits, made from sour milk and curdled cheese, were simple but nourishing, offering comfort and sustenance during long, exhausting days. The tangy flavor of sour milk added depth to the biscuits, and the crumbly, slightly dense texture made them perfect for sopping up gravy, stew, or any sauce available. The dough for these biscuits was made by combining sour milk with flour, a little salt, and baking soda, which helped give them a little rise despite the denser nature of the ingredients. If there was any leftover cheese, it would be crumbled into the mixture, providing richness and flavor that was essential when fresh food was often scarce. The cheese used could vary depending on what was available, but a hard, salty cheese like cheddar or even homemade curds would work perfectly. Once the dough was mixed, it was gently rolled out, cut into rounds, and baked in the oven, or, more commonly, in a cast iron skillet or Dutch oven over an open fire. The biscuits would bake to a golden brown hue with a slight crispiness on the outside and a soft, tender interior. The sour milk would have given them a pleasant tang, which paired wonderfully with the salty cheese and made them stand out from other biscuits of the time. These sour milk cheese biscuits were often eaten for breakfast with a dollop of jam or served alongside a midday stew or fried meat. But they were versatile enough to be eaten with whatever was on hand, whether it was beans, gravy, or just butter. For cowboys and settlers who lived off whatever they could gather or trade, these biscuits were an easy way to make the most of available ingredients. They were filling, comforting, and could be eaten on the go or served as part of a larger meal. Sour milk cheese biscuits weren't just a way to use up spoiled milk. They were a reflection of the creative and resourceful spirit of the frontier. In a time when fresh ingredients were often a luxury, these humble biscuits offered a way to make something satisfying and delicious from what was at hand. Whether baked over a fire or in a homestead kitchen, sour milk cheese biscuits brought warmth, flavor, and sustenance to a table that often had little else. Salted cod poke with buttermilk slaw. In the Wild West, settlers and cowhands had to be incredibly resourceful with the food they had available to them. Salted cod, a preserved fish that could withstand the long journeys and storage times needed on the frontier, was a common ingredient in many dishes. Cod was often salted to preserve it, and salted cod poke with buttermilk slaw was one of the ways this durable fish was turned into a hearty, filling meal. The dish combined the briny, robust flavor of salted cod with the tangy, refreshing crunch of buttermilk slaw, a combination that satisfied both the stomach and the soul. Salted cod, often bought in large salted blocks, was soaked for hours to remove the excess salt, rehydrating the fish and softening its texture. After soaking, the fish was either fried or stewed with a little fat, such as lard or bacon grease, until golden brown and crispy on the outside while still tender on the inside. The fish itself was hearty and packed with protein, making it a perfect meal to keep the body nourished through long, exhausting days. On the side, the buttermilk slaw added a cool, zesty contrast to the richness of the cod. Cabbage, a staple vegetable in frontier kitchens, was finely shredded and mixed with buttermilk, vinegar, salt, and sometimes a touch of sugar or mustard to create a tangy, creamy dressing. The slaw was crunchy, with a refreshing bite that cut through the saltiness of the cod and brought balance to the meal. Sometimes wild onions or other locally foraged vegetables would be added to the slaw for extra flavor. Together, salted cod poke with buttermilk slaw was a meal that combined the salty, savory flavors of preserved fish with the cool, creamy crunch of slaw, perfect for the hardworking people of the Wild West. The cod was an excellent source of protein, and the buttermilk slaw added a much-needed touch of freshness and variety to the otherwise simple dish. It wasn't an extravagant meal, but it was one that gave strength and sustenance to those who needed it most. This dish also reflected the practicality of frontier life. In an era before refrigeration, preserved foods like salted cod were a lifeline, able to withstand the challenges of long storage and limited access to fresh food. Salted cod poke with buttermilk slaw wasn't just a meal. It was a reminder of how settlers had to adapt to the harsh conditions of the Wild West, using the resources they had in creative ways to ensure they were fed and ready for the next day's work. Stewed okra with bacon drippings and bread ends. In the unforgiving, sun-baked expanses of the Wild West, food had to be resourceful and practical, often made with whatever could be found. Stewed okra with bacon drippings and bread ends was the perfect frontier dish, built around ingredients that were readily available to those living in small, self-sufficient homesteads or traveling across the open plains. Okra, a vegetable introduced to the West from the southern states, thrived in arid climates, making it a favorite among settlers and cowhands. The dish made use of this hearty vegetable, the richness of bacon drippings, and the often overlooked but vital leftover bread ends. Those crusty, often discarded bits that were too small for regular slicing, but had plenty of life left in them. Okra itself had a unique texture, often slimy when stewed, but it was this very characteristic that made it such a versatile and beloved vegetable in frontier kitchens. It was inexpensive, filling, and could be stretched to feed many with just a little effort. The bacon drippings, a staple of any Wild West kitchen, provided the necessary fat for cooking and added the smoky, savory flavor that was essential to frontier cooking. When you didn't have the luxury of spices and fancy ingredients, the fats from bacon were critical for adding depth and richness to even the simplest of dishes. The process of making stewed okra with bacon drippings began with rendering the bacon fat. Once the bacon was crisped up, the drippings were left in the skillet or Dutch oven, and fresh okra, often sliced into rounds, was added. The okra would quickly absorb the bacon fat, softening into tender, slightly slimy pieces that soaked up all the savory flavors from the bacon. Salt and pepper were the basics for seasoning, but if available, a touch of garlic or a handful of wild onions might be tossed in to add extra flavor. Cooking the okra in bacon drippings not only softened the vegetable, but also gave it a wonderfully smoky flavor that complemented the richness of the fat. On the side, the bread ends, a simple yet crucial element, were fried in more bacon drippings until crispy and golden brown. These often overlooked crusts were perfect for soaking up the stewed okra's flavorful sauce. As the bread hardened on the outside and crisped up in the fat, it transformed into a perfect textural contrast to the soft, juicy okra. This humble combination of flavors, crunchy, savory bread with tender, smoky okra, created a meal that was both hearty and satisfying, ideal for fueling a long day of work or travel. What made this dish so important in the Wild West was its simplicity and the resourcefulness it demanded. For settlers and cowhands, there was no room for waste. Leftover bacon fat and day-old bread were turned into a full meal using ingredients that had long shelf lives or could be easily found in the wild or in small homestead gardens. Okra, which could be grown in hot, dry climates, was a perfect vegetable for this type of cooking, low maintenance and easy to harvest. Stewed okra with bacon drippings and bread ends wasn't a meal for indulgence. It was about survival and comfort. The people who lived and worked in the West didn't have access to the same luxuries we have today, where fresh fruits, vegetables, and meats are just a grocery store away. Instead, meals had to be made from what was on hand, stretching each ingredient to its fullest potential. This dish epitomized that spirit, turning simple, everyday ingredients into a flavorful, filling meal that could provide much-needed nourishment for hardworking people. This dish also speaks to the pioneering nature of frontier cooking, where nothing went to waste and every part of an ingredient was used to its fullest. In a world where a pantry might be bare or supplies could be scarce, being able to turn old bread into a vital part of a meal was not just practical, it was essential. Stewed okra with bacon drippings and bread ends was the kind of meal that could be eaten in the quiet of a homestead kitchen or around a campfire after a long day on the trail. It was both humble and satisfying, embodying the resourcefulness, resilience, and creativity of those who lived in the Wild West. Cracker porridge with sorghum drizzle. In the Wild West, where food often had to be simple, hearty, and resourceful, cracker porridge with sorghum drizzle was the perfect dish for a filling, inexpensive meal. With fresh food often in short supply, settlers, cowhands, and travelers learned to make the most of basic pantry staples, and this dish was a clever way to stretch limited ingredients into something satisfying. Soda crackers, which could be found in nearly every homesteader chuck wagon, were transformed into a hearty porridge by breaking them into pieces and simmering them in water or milk. This process softened the crackers into a warm, mushy base that was both comforting and filling. What made this dish stand out was the drizzle of sorghum syrup, a beloved sweetener in the Wild West. Sorghum, a tall, grass-like plant native to Africa, was introduced to the Americas and thrived in the arid conditions of the West. Sorghum syrup, which had a rich, molasses-like flavor, became a staple in many frontier kitchens. Its deep, earthy sweetness was perfect for drizzling over the soft cracker porridge, adding complexity and flavor that elevated this humble dish. The syrup not only provided sweetness, but also a much-needed energy boost for those who worked long hours on the trail or in the fields. Cracker porridge with sorghum drizzle was the kind of meal that could be whipped up quickly with ingredients that were either stored in bulk or easily traded. It was simple, but it was also nourishing, filling the belly and giving the energy needed for a long day of work. The crackers absorbed the milk or water, creating a creamy texture, while the sorghum syrup added a comforting sweetness. It was a great way to make use of stale crackers, turning them into a warm, soft meal that could feed a family or a group of cowboys gathered around the fire. This dish was practical and resourceful, traits that defined so much of frontier cooking. It wasn't about having access to fresh fruits, vegetables, or gourmet ingredients. Instead, it was about making the most of what you had, turning simple pantry items into a dish that could nourish and sustain you. Cracker porridge with sorghum drizzle may have been a modest meal, but it encapsulated the pioneering spirit of the Wild West, making do with limited resources and finding comfort in the simplest of foods. As we wrap up our journey through 30 forgotten Wild West lunches, it's clear that the heart of frontier cooking was all about ingenuity, resourcefulness, and making do with what you had. These meals weren't about fancy ingredients or elaborate techniques. They were born out of necessity, crafted to sustain those working the land, traveling the trails, or building new communities in an untamed world. Whether it was a simple dish like cracker porridge with sorghum drizzle or a more rugged plate, like salted cod poke with buttermilk slaw, each meal tells a story of survival, community, and the spirit of adventure that defined the Wild West. So, the next time you find yourself looking for something different to try in the kitchen, think back to these meals of the past. Sometimes, the simplest ingredients, cooked with care and creativity, can make the most memorable meals. Thanks for joining us on this journey through history, and remember, the Wild West may be long gone, but its flavors live on.